So, a while back I heard about this operating system called TempleOS. And it wasn't until recently that I decided to try it out for myself. If you don't already know, TempleOS is an operating system that was created by one man named Terry Davis. But don't let its simplistic looks fool you. Some of the functionality in this thing is actually mind-blowing. The entire thing is written in a language called HolyC, which is essentially Terry's version of C with a few C++ features mixed in. It features a bootloader, a multitasking kernel, compiler, text editor, graphics library, and a handful of games all in under 20 megabytes. After trying out some of the games in TempleOS, I thought it'd be fun to try to make my own. Here's how it went. Once I was done messing around with the games, it was time to get to work and figure out how to create and edit files. After doing a little research, I figured out how to open the text editor and write my first Hello World program in HolyC. After I had my first working program, the next step was to figure out how to create and display graphics. From what I could gather, all of the graphics in TempleOS games are drawn directly into HolyC files using a sprite editor inside TempleOS. This is obviously something way different than what you would see in modern game development. Luckily, I found a video of Terry explaining how to do it. So for starters, I decided to just make a simple triangle. And once I was done, all I had to do was call the sprite function and pass it a pointer to the triangle. And we have our first graphical program. Next up was figuring out how to get the program to run in an infinite loop, read input from the keyboard, and move the triangle around. What's really cool about TempleOS is that you can see all of the source code for every program that Terry wrote, so I was able to reverse engineer the movement code from the games pretty easily. After I had a triangle that could move around, I decided to go with making a shooter game. So the next step was to make our fancy spaceship able to fire some bullets. This wasn't too difficult, but I did run into some scary looking errors along the way. At this point, I realized that I wasn't able to move in multiple directions at once or fire bullets while moving, so I needed to fix the input code. Unfortunately, none of the games that Terry wrote had this functionality, so I didn't have anything to reference. But after a while of digging around in the TempleOS source code, I came up with a solution. In TempleOS, it isn't possible to receive input from multiple keys per frame, so instead of moving the player whenever a key is pressed, I stored the state of the key and then moved the player depending on which keys were being held down. This made for much smoother movement and also allowed for firing while moving. After the controls were in order, it was time to start adding some enemies. The next step was to get the enemies to shoot bullets at the player. I'm sure most of you have played Space Invaders before, and the enemy attacks in that game are kind of boring, so I wanted to make something a bit more challenging. After messing around with some basic trigonometry, I had enemies shooting bullets in a circular pattern that should make for some pretty challenging gameplay. Next up was to add in some collision detection so that the player's bullets would be able to destroy enemies. Collision detection is always a pain for me to implement, but luckily, collisions between two circles is the easiest to handle. It's pretty obvious that each bullet is a circle, but I also added an invisible circle around each enemy to act as its collider. And after a while, I had the basic collision detection working with the player's bullets disappearing as they collide with the enemies. Then I gave the enemies some HP and a poorly drawn explosion sprite to be shown when they're destroyed. The final thing to do was to add in collision detection for the enemy bullets and the player. I also added in a heart sprite to show how much HP the player has left. And after giving our fancy triangle a little update, it was time for a full test run. Coding this game in HolyC was a pretty fun challenge, and if you haven't tried out TempleOS yet, I highly recommend downloading it and giving it a go. If you want to check out the code for the game, a link to the GitHub repository will be in the description. Thanks for watching.